Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 26B, an interview on how Teddy Roosevelt was made in New York with Ted Kohn. I'm excited to welcome Ted Kohn back to the show today. Ted is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont, and a historian of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. He's written several books about Theodore Roosevelt, including A Most Glorious Ride, The Diaries of Theodore Roosevelt, and Heir to the Empire City, New York and the Making of Theodore Roosevelt. I had Ted on not too long ago to discuss one of New York's other presidents, Grover Cleveland, but today we're going to discuss the man I can only assume is Ted's favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt, and how he was made in New York. Ted, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thanks, Kenny. Great to be back.
So if we're going to get to know how New York made Theodore Roosevelt, I kind of think we have to start by getting to know New York City. What was New York like when Theodore Roosevelt was born into this city? And what was it like as he was growing up there?
Yeah, well, if the end of the 19th century in the United States, I mean, it's really a story of, massive urbanization, then I think New York City is probably urbanization on steroids. I mean, New York's not just the biggest city in New York. It's the immigration hub. It's the import-export hub. It's the shipping hub. It's the financial commercial hub. It's a manufacturing hub. It's bursting at the seams. And for Theodore Roosevelt, it's maybe maybe one of the more boring ways to think about Theodore Roosevelt, but at the end of the day, the kind of progressive he's an urban progressive. How do you make American cities cleaner, safer, healthier, less corrupt places to live? And boy, at the end of the 19th century and just after the Civil War, when Theodore Roosevelt is growing up, this is a big challenge.
Is that what the social movements of the city were at that day? Were they grappling with these progressive, these labor manufacturing, this quality of life issues?
Yeah, so there's lots of, good anti-corruption, good government movements, social reform movements. Theodore Roosevelt's father had been involved in civil service reform, which again, I mean, this is something that Roosevelt is consistent about through his entire, public career. How do you get a civil service from policemen to postmen, who are hired and fired and promoted, not based on who you know or who you give money to, but actually based on merit and skills and knowledge. And that by having a foundation of permanent civil service people, people who don't just come in and out based on who's serving in office, what party's serving in office. This was meant to be a great way of kind of undoing the spoil system, undoing the position of machine bosses, which Roosevelt grapples with at the city and state level for his entire career, and make New York City a less corrupt place to be.
So the Roosevelt family had been in New York City for a long time by the time Theodore came onto the scene. Where did the Roosevelts fit into that kind of New York politico-economic pecking order? And what was it like growing up in such a family?
Yeah, Roosevelt, the Roosevelts go back to New York when it was New Amsterdam, right? Before it was, and they were the Rosenvelds, from Dutch stock. And they're definitely considered patriarchs of the city, a founding family of the city. There's already a Roosevelt Street by the time Theodore Roosevelt is born. Theodore Roosevelt's grandfather, Cornelius Van Schack Roosevelt, one of the richest men in New York, and it seems like he's got his fingers in everything: mining, shipping, banking, real estate. And so this is Theodore Roosevelt's not just born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's born with like a golden shovel. I mean, he is really at the topmost of the socioeconomic and social stratum of New York society. And so Roosevelt is born into a Gramercy Park brownstone. Gramercy Park, one of these rare private parks in the middle of New York City, based on like the London model where you need a key to get in, and a brownstone that comes equipped with things like central plumbing and central heating in this very kind of exclusive enclave of New York. But at the same time, because of his father's interest in charitable pursuits, Newsboys Lodging House, but based on where Gramercy Park is in the 20s, the Roosevelts are coming up, rubbing shoulders with the changes that are taking place in New York City. You don't have to go too far along Broadway near Gramercy Park to kind of come up against, the expanding tenements. And so, Roosevelt's growing up in the 20s, but that's at a time when his social class are kind of, marching uptown slowly along Fifth Avenue, heading towards Central Park. But absolutely, Roosevelt is born into one of the most elite families in New York City.
And is he one of the wealthiest upbringings of any American president?
I think so. I mean, it's, if you think back to, kind of the early ones, you
Right.
still have, the Washingtons, the Adams, absolutely. You have some real elite, planter elite, Southern elite, slave owning elite. But Roosevelt's, for the late 19th century and the 20th century, pretty elite. Franklin Roosevelt.
Fair.
All the Roosevelts were pretty wealthy family. But I think you have to think Roosevelt, and Roosevelt goes on to Harvard, which is kind of cultivates his connections with other elites like in Boston. But I do think that something that marks his career, whether it's in this, from his childhood to the state assembly to police commissioner, he does really kind of get his hands dirty. He does see how the other half lives. He does go into the tenement districts of New York City. So I think it's easy to, label Roosevelt when he's simply in his early 20s getting into New York politics as some sort of dilettante, as people have, attending political party meetings in his silk top hat and tail on the way to the opera at a time when New York politics is a pretty dirty business. But, he earns his bones pretty quickly and really does come into, he's not just defending his brownstone elite class, but that's also something that gets him in trouble as well with his brownstone elite class, as it will with Franklin Roosevelt later.
Well, let's start diving into that career. So, Mr. New York, Theodore Roosevelt, as you said, he leaves New York to attend Harvard in Massachusetts, and then he comes back to the Big Apple to study for law school, but he abandoned those plans to run for the New York State Assembly instead at the age of 23. Why do you do that? What inspires him to say, I'm going to get into this politics then?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think both family things and his personality. I think number one, at the death of his father, while he's a sophomore at Harvard, his father's only 46 years old when he dies of painful stomach cancer. I think that loomed large in Roosevelt's life. Theodore Roosevelt Sr., had a huge impact on New York City. One of the founding members of the Union League Club during the Civil War, one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Museum of Natural History, beloved in New York City, right? All the church bells rang when Theodore Roosevelt Sr. died. And if you read Roosevelt's diaries while he's at Harvard after his father dies, this just leaves Roosevelt adrift. And especially Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He's the namesake of this great man. Time and time again, he says there's no way he will ever be able to live up to the legacy of his father, who was just this great, beloved man who had such an impact on New York and its inhabitants. So I think, number one, that has a really big influence on Roosevelt. Number two, that year living in New York, walking from his mother's house on 57th Street all the way down to his law school on Great Jones Street, this was a path he took every day that probably showed him the contrasts of New York City in the Gilded Age. He'd walk along the new, mansions being built along Fifth Avenue, being put up by the Waldorfs and Astors. and the Vanderbilts, but he was also walking through some of the kind of the worst tenement districts in New York. He'd probably have to walk past the piles of garbage and over dead horses, walk past some of the 10,000 homeless children in New York at the time. And we know Roosevelt, he's one who gets action. He's not one to kind of see things and say, well, that's somebody else's problem. And so when he starts attending these meetings and Morton Hall in New York, again, rough and tumble world of New York politics, really, I mean, getting your hands dirty, having to stick up for yourself. Like you said, he's in his early 20s, Harvard educated, a Roosevelt of the Roosevelt family. It's a rough and tumble, masculine, virile world that I think Roosevelt found very attractive. And so a lot of writers will talk about, the West being this crucible for Roosevelt, like masculinity and virility. But, where was the first time that he was really kind of like throwing and taking verbal punches and standing toe to toe with some of the roughest politicos in New York? He's 23 years old and doing this at his local Republican district meeting place, going there every single week for about 8 months before he receives that Republican nomination.
How fascinating. Okay, so Theodore Roosevelt, he gets into politics. He wins that first election at 23. What's his career like in the state assembly? What kind of politician did he run as? What did he accomplish? And how does he evolve in those years?
Yeah, he really gets some great experience, I think, in those few years on how the nitty-gritty of politics works. He runs as a reformer, trying to be independent of the machine. And again, he's representing his district in New York City. So I think that's kind of key. He's serving up in Albany, but especially he gets a seat on the city's committee because New York City doesn't really have home rule at this time. Most of the laws that apply to New York City are actually made in Albany. And so this is what Roosevelt has a hand in. How do you reform things like street cleaning or the police or the water supply in New York City? You pass laws about these things in New York. One of the first laws that he really champions that actually ends up with his name on it, called the Roosevelt Bill. It's also known as the Aldermanic Bill. And the aldermen at the time in New York City were these kind of like appointed, shadowy figures that nobody really knew in the pocket of the city bosses, but they had the tremendous amount of power that a mayor could not nominate department heads. And I mean, that's street cleaning, police, fire chief, without the alderman approving the nomination. So there is this great check on the power of the mayor. And Roosevelt wanted to take that power away, invest it in a strong executive, which is what was happening across the East River in Brooklyn. And he was actually able to do this. And so this is kind of one of these, and again, only in his early 20s. Yeah. So interested in a strong executive power in New York City as a way to undermine the power of especially the Tammany Hall Democratic bosses. And one of the ways that he did this, he ushered the bill through, was while that bill was going through, he was also tapped to be the chair of a city's investigating committee. So these had very public hearings covered in the press, bringing witnesses in front of it, including like the boss of Tammany Hall, Honest John Kelly, and asking them questions, basically, well, what was the deal you made with the mayor to get this police chief nominated or get the fire chief nominated, or the sheriff, who's the head of the Ludlow Street prison, about, basically like there's a bar that's being, operated inside the prison that, guards are being paid off, to, allow, prisoners out of their cells. They put prisoners intentionally in like the worst cells and then extort money from them. Prisoners will basically pay money to decorate their cells with like
I'd
furniture.
like a room upgrade, please.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so it chronicles the money that's being, peeled off, skimmed off the top of New York, right? Why does the New York City clerk pay $10,000 to have his position? Because the clerk collects like all the fines and payments in New York, and they expect that some of that money is going to go in their pocket, and
Hard to
some of
keep
that
track of
money
it
is
all.
going to go, to the machine. So this is a real education for Roosevelt on, how to have relations with the press, and how to get bills passed that will undermine the machine, and also, get you get legislation passed, right? So, which is what Roosevelt did, and get some good, make some connections, make some allies in the state legislature, and make some friends among the press as well.
That is fascinating. I also just love the name. What was it? Honest John Kelly. I have a
Honest
feeling
John
there's
Kelly.
something tongue in cheek about it.
Because he was so completely honest about the graft and what the position, what the place was of a machine, right? So of course, this is the way we operate. So he was honest John, completely open and above board on, he's making money, and money is the lubricant of this machine called New York City.
So Roosevelt, he also started making some important friends around this time, like Henry Cabot Lodge. Why is Lodge important? How did they meet, and what drew them together?
Yeah, they really become friends before the 1884 Republican National Convention. They both want to stand against the presumptive Republican nominee, James Blaine of Maine, because he's corrupt. He's tainted. He took money while he was Speaker of the House to benefit railroads. So they want to kind of fight a rear action and champion instead a more progressive candidate, a very bland, gray candidate, Senator George Edmunds of Vermont. And so they come together and they collaborate beforehand, visiting each other's homes, and they start to kind of become friends at this time. So it's a political alliance, but it's also very personal as well. I talked about Roosevelt's father dying. A lot of people have speculated that the older Roosevelt, about 8 or 9 years older, is a bit of a father figure to Roosevelt. He's certainly a lifelong political mentor to Roosevelt. Every time Roosevelt comes to a crossroads in his political career, including whether or not he should take the Republican nomination in 1900, Lodge is there giving key advice. But it's this kind of friendship at their losing effort at the Republican National Convention in 1884, when they see how things are going against them. And at some point, Lodge says, this is completely useless, and I feel completely alone. I'm just battling against this, just me on my own. And Roosevelt says, well, I'll stand with you, and then there'll be two of us. And I see that moment in time as kind of cementing their relationship. So they end up losing in their effort, in this very kind of high profile public effort against the person who ends up getting the Republican nomination. But I think it really cements their friendship, and their friendship is a political alliance. Yes. And I think it's really hard in the 19th century to separate those two, right? You look at their letters to each other, and they're voluminous. They weave back and forth about, talking about their families and talking about politics, talking about, the personal views of individuals in politics. At this time, the politics is very personal. So I think it's really hard to kind of cut the baby in two. Their political alliance is their personal friendship, and vice versa.
Yeah, and a lot, like you said, Lodge will be there all through his career, kind of the sounding board advice. And for my listeners, we'll see more of Lodge like in future presidencies too. This is a guy, especially when you get to Woodrow Wilson, you're going to really get to know him then. Okay, so you mentioned 1884, that convention's that year. It's a big year for other reasons. He will abruptly quit his New York political career and head west, as you mentioned, to kind of become a rancher cowboy. Why?
Well, I mean, the main reason that people point to is in 1884, very famously, his wife and mother die on the same day, on Valentine's Day, on February 14th. Roosevelt is up in Albany, going through the second reading of his Roosevelt bill, and his wife is basically 9 months pregnant at the time. And initially, a telegram comes to Roosevelt on the floor of the state legislature announcing the birth of a baby daughter. And so people break out the cigars and they're slapping him on the back. It's a high moment in Roosevelt's life, politically, personally. And then he gets a follow-up telegram basically summoning him back to New York City. He gets on the train, heads back down the Hudson, runs up the stairs of his mother's house, and his brother meets him, Elliot, meets him at the top of the stairs, distraught, basically saying, Alice Lee, his wife, and mother are both dying. And within, the baby's fine, but within the next 24 hours, both his beloved wife and mother die on the same day. I mean, this is, and when you read Roosevelt's diary, he basically was like, "That's it. I'm done. Right? I had my run. I had my love. I had my life, and that's it." And so, in many ways, heading out to the Badlands of the Dakota Territory, this kind of bleak landscape that perhaps is a mirror into Roosevelt's feelings, maybe even his depression at the time, and politically as well. He had this huge setback in 1884 with Henry Cabot Lodge, and so politically, personally, maybe in 1884 he really thinks that that's it. And, he writes in his diary, "Yeah, I'm going to try writing for a while. I'll try working at, he owns a couple of cattle ranches. He'll try to be a working cattleman and try to make his money that way. But that's it. He's his life, the light has gone out of his life, and he really is at a crossroads. What's the future bring in 1884? He is just not sure."
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons people or at least I find him so compelling, is he's a guy with such tragedy in his life, but then such perseverance too, and just interesting rebound mechanisms at that. So you're right. He runs off to the Dakotas. He spends just kind of a couple years out west before he comes back to New York. And it's kind of funny that you mentioned that he passed some law to make the mayor of New York more powerful, because he runs for mayor when he comes back and he falls short. What's the story of this campaign? Why is this a rare Roosevelt loss? What does he learn?
Yeah, it's interesting. So he's out west in New York, but he always makes sure he takes the train back east in the fall of 1884, 1885, and 1886, which is not just political season, but it's nomination season. So I think it's a certain indication that maybe after a little while, his family's still back east. He has a newborn baby back east in the care of his sisters, Henry Cabot Lodge and his wife, Nanny Lodge, who Roosevelt ends up just being, enamored with. Both of them are back out east. Maybe he's looking for a way to get a position back in New York so he can come home and reintegrate himself into the city, his home city. Roosevelt accepts the nomination in 1886, when it's pretty much known that the Republicans are going to go down for a loss. It's a very strange election when there's a United Labor candidate by the name of Henry George that just scares the bejesus out of everybody. He is a radical kind of social reformer, economic reformer. He believes in land redistribution. And so there's a great thought that if the Democrats can just name somebody who's kind of sane and safe, that the Republicans are just going to, in good conscience, go vote for the Democrat so that this Henry George guy does not get elected. A number of top Republicans that year actually turned down the nomination. Wow. Roosevelt accepts it. Number one, to get back into New York City politics, but also Roosevelt had been really responsible for splitting the New York Republican Party in 1884. James Blaine loses New York State and the presidency by only under 1,200 votes, which means if 600 kind of mugwumps or independent Republicans had switched their votes.
Yeah.
People like Roosevelt's milieu, James Blaine, and not Grover Cleveland would have been elected president of the United States. And a lot of New York Republicans absolutely point at Roosevelt and blame him. So Roosevelt is really being asked, especially to help unite New York City Republicans on the eve of the 1888 presidential election. Roosevelt knows it. He knows it's kind of a losing battle, but he also knows he has to do it to kind of make up for his role in 1884 and get back into a position in the New York City Republican Party.
That is fascinating. So that is the Teddy Roosevelt Atonement Tour. To get back in the good graces.
Yeah, he likens himself. It's one or two Curtius, which I had to look up. Right, it's a kind of a mythological Roman youth who rode his horse into a chasm, a crack that appeared in ancient Rome, and by doing so, saved Rome and brought Rome together. So the very fact that Roosevelt, he sees himself as a sacrifice candidate for his own greater good, absolutely, but for the greater good of the party. And when you listen to his speeches that year, absolutely, it's all about unity and a united Republican Party.
So like I have trouble even saying that loss is a setback now, given like the greater goals it accomplished. So okay.
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, think of it. It's 1886. This is a guy born in 1858. He's 28 years old when he receives the Republican nomination, right? This is a long path that he's on. Some historians have said, oh, absolutely, this is his only electoral setback until the 1912 presidential election. You can't even bring up 1886 without him being furious. No way. At this time, it's not just politically. Lodge wins his seat in Congress. And Roosevelt is so happy for Henry Cabot Lodge. Roosevelt secretly has been seeing his old flame from childhood, Edith Carow, and they've become secretly engaged. And they've already booked passage over to England where they're going to get married over Christmas. So Roosevelt's got a whole lot going on that he's happy about. The loss in 1886 really doesn't bother him much at all.
All right. So this loss, not a setback, but it doesn't at least immediately reestablish him in New York. He goes off, he gets married, he does some book writing, he goes to DC, he's a civil service commissioner for a while. And then in 1894, he returns to New York again to take up a job as police commissioner. How did this come about, and why does he take this opportunity?
Yeah, he got nominated after Benjamin Harris becomes president in 1888, and then Grover Cleveland comes back for a second term, and Cleveland, a Democrat, keeps Roosevelt on as a Republican civil service commissioner. It's a pretty untenuous position to be in Washington anyway. But again, Roosevelt, with Lodge's mentorship, looking at that next national step, right? He has been now in these appointed positions outside of New York City for some time now, still needs to reestablish himself back in New York City. That's going to be the platform for any future role. And if he can do good work for the Republicans in 1896 and get a Republican elected president, somebody with the stature of Theodore Roosevelt might be up for even a cabinet level position in Washington, D.C. So these couple years he spends as police commissioner. It's very, very calculated coming back to New York City.
So what's he dealing with as police commissioner, and how does it shape him?
Yeah, I mean, police commissioner, right before Roosevelt becomes police commissioner, a report comes out from the Lexow Committee, one of these investigating reports. It basically identifies the entire New York City police force, like 4,000 people, as probably the single biggest corrupt enterprise in New York, right?
Shocking.
I mean, this is organized crime, right? A hugely profitable, from the beat cop up to the chief of police who's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is what Roosevelt's after, and that the corrupt police force, which skims off from every person who wants to do business in New York. You're a greengrocer who wants to stock your trade out on the sidewalk. You pay off the police officer. You want to keep your saloon open on Sundays when there's a law that says you have to close it. You pay a police officer. You want to run a brothel, you pay a police officer. And the police officers and the police are, political allies with John Kelly and Tammany Hall. So if you go after police corruption, which is also the right thing to do for Theodore Roosevelt, you're also undermining that alliance with the Democratic machine. So Roosevelt goes about this in a couple ways. He does try to professionalize the force. It's a police commission, very similar to civil service commission. It's like a civilian oversight board trying to make sure that hiring, firing, promotions based on merit, right? Not based on simply who you know or who you pay off. And one of the things that he goes after are the saloons. Not because he's some kind of teetotaler, this is some sort of moral crusade, but the fact that there is a Sunday saloon closing law, a blue law, that is always absolutely flouted in New York. It is, and is flouted because people pay off the police. Right. So Roosevelt feels if this law is actually enforced equitably, this would take money out of the pockets of the police and undermine that alliance with the Tammany Hall allies. And he's very successful in doing that. Of the 12 to 14,000 saloons operating in New York City at the time, very quickly he's able on Sundays, because this is what the law says, to close about 96% of them.
That is fascinating. So once again, he's kind of doing some of the party's work, probably unpopular party's work this time. I mean, I imagine those New Yorkers were going to the saloons because they liked the saloons.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, some Republican voting blocs like German Americans. This is very much in their culture that, yes, they go to church on Sunday and then they go to a beer hall afterwards. And so taking this away from them, this was really kind of angering a big ethnic group in New York City that Republicans depended on.
So he does this for a couple years, and then my understanding is he kind of gets run off the beat almost. Like he outwears his welcome with his crusading here. First off, is that an accurate description of his leaving of this role? In 1896, he's going to go serve as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Is that why he does that?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, yes, it looks like Albany is about to pass a law that's going to legislate Theodore Roosevelt's position out of existence, and he opines this with Henry Cabot Lodge home, and it's kind of sad, right? New York City is the city of his birth. He probably will never have, after being police commissioner, a position in New York City ever again. And it's Lodge who says, well, wait a second, this kind of like prohibitionist anti-alcohol stance isn't very popular in New York City. But outside the city, in upstate, much more conservative New York, you are making a name for yourself. So what you've done as police commissioner, yes, maybe this is the end of your New York City career, but you're setting yourself up maybe for the next statewide position. And Lodge, back that by this time is in the Senate, he says maybe even sitting here from being a U.S. Senator in Washington, D.C., but at the same time, helping McKinley get elected, being nominated for a sub-cabinet position in Washington, D.C., allowing him to go back to D.C., allowing his wife to go back to D.C. This is something that's also very attractive to Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, think about it. Within a couple of years, going from being one of 4 police commissioners in New York City to being Assistant Secretary of the Navy at a time when, foreign policy and a new American foreign policy and building a new modern Navy is actually a very important position.
Okay, so TR, again, he's going to spend some time away from New York now, a couple years at the Navy Department. He's going to go fight the Spanish-American War with the Rough Riders. But, eventually, you guessed it, he is going to come home again as a war hero to run for governor of New York. What's the story this time? How did he become the party's nominee? How did he win? What's he do as governor?
And this is where we have to introduce the Republican state boss, Thomas Platt, right? The easy boss. I mean, he has New York State Republican machine in his pocket. In his autobiography, Platt's autobiography that he writes, he talks about he got several Republican presidents elected president. He has enormous power at the state and national stage. But before Roosevelt fights in 1898, some of the elections in New York State aren't going so well for Platt. Platt actually needs to kind of enhance his position in New York. And his handpicked governor at the time, Frank Black, is really becoming very unpopular and has an untenable position. And so people are starting to say, Theodore Roosevelt, New Yorker, Roosevelt of the New York Roosevelts, and now a national war hero. As long as Platt can get assurances from Roosevelt that Roosevelt will not, quote unquote, make war on the machine, that he'll actually defer to Platt, right? That there's going to be a partnership here. It's not, Governor Roosevelt doing things without consulting Platt, without, listening to Platt's summons down to New York City. When Platt wants to, kind of tell the governor what to do, then Platt will back Roosevelt for governor of New York. And Roosevelt gives those assurances. All right. He says he's going to work in partnership before he makes any nominations to any state positions. He will consult with Boss Platt on these positions. So he makes sort of a devil's bargain with the easy boss to get into the governor's mansion in Albany.
Does he keep those promises?
Largely he does. There's a narrative, I know, that by 1900, with the death of the Vice President Garrett Hobart, that Platt is very unhappy with Roosevelt for his kind of radical reforming, independent agenda. But that kind of narrative is formed more by Theodore Roosevelt, writing in his autobiography in 1913 after he didn't get the Republican nomination for president in 1912. It's after his 1910 New Nationalism speech, which is a fairly kind of radical, progressive, turn by Roosevelt. At the time, in 1900, people are saying, actually, Roosevelt's being pretty deferential to Platt and the machine. He's talking about not having a lot of kind of, wasted excess legislature. A lot of the mugwump and progressives in New York City are actually pretty unhappy with Roosevelt because of this. People like E.L. Godkin of the Evening Post, really kind of critical that Roosevelt isn't being more independent and more of a reformer. And one of the reasons for this is by 1900, Roosevelt wants to keep being governor. Right? He wants Platt backing him to get the nomination again for governor. So it makes sense that at the time, Roosevelt and others see Roosevelt as actually, working fairly well with Platt and the machine.
So was that enough for Platt? Because there certainly is, like you mentioned, there's this narrative out there that Platt wanted to get rid of Roosevelt, kind of almost snuck him onto the ticket. Roosevelt a bit ambivalent about it, and even say Mark Hanna, who's the assistant of the kind of campaign manager, you might almost say, of President McKinley, being like, "Are you guys crazy? You can't put him there." So it makes it seem like they didn't want him. What's that about?
I mean, I think Roosevelt has shown great ability to intervene as governor in local elections to support progressive candidates, much like himself, while still working with the machine. And I think this tightrope act that Roosevelt is able to do through his entire career of kind of balancing between these kind of reform Republicans, much like himself, and machine politicians. I think this is one of Roosevelt's great strengths. He is not a mugwump. He is not an independent reformer. He does not break with the party until 1912, when a lot of Republicans do. He always feels that the way to get things done is to work from inside the party. And that means making certain compromises. But his ability to do that arguably might be seen as a challenge to somebody like Thomas Platt. Is Roosevelt by 1900, actually maybe somebody who could challenge Platt for the leadership of the party? And the second thing is, with 1900, a presidential election year, Roosevelt only won the governorship by about 18,000 votes.
True. Yeah.
Platt's all about the state, right? How do you get big Republican state turnout in a presidential election year, right? You put a favorite son candidate on the ticket. And so that's what happens absolutely in 1900. There is huge Republican turnout in New York State. The new Republican nominee, one of Platt's lieutenants, a guy by the name of Benjamin Odell, doesn't win by 18,000 votes. He wins by 110,000 votes. New York State Republicans pick up 4 seats in Congress, and the New York State Republicans, win huge majorities in the New York State legislature. Those Republican wins in New York State translate exactly to more patronage and more power for whom? For Thomas Platt. McKinley and Roosevelt win in Washington in 1900 for president and vice president. Boss Platt wins in New York State big time.
That is crazy. The thought of Roosevelt as the VP on the ticket is a bigger draw than Roosevelt as the governor on the ticket. That is wild. What can be learned from what can we learn from Theodore Roosevelt's New York experience kind of all up? It feels like there's times he blows through like a hurricane. 3 times. Maybe he I don't know if it's, you've educated me. Initially, I was thinking he annoys the party leadership, but it seems more like they got their use of him. And then he moves on. His whole career is just this jagged line. Is it genius? Is it luck? What can we learn from it?
I think he always does refer to New York as the city of his birth, right? He will always vote in New York State, New York City elections. He retires, of course, out to Oyster Bay on Long Island after he's president, and he goes off for a year for that African safari and a tour through Europe, where he meets all the heads of states and he goes horseback riding with the Kaiser. He lands back in New York City, and there's like a 1 million person parade for Theodore Roosevelt as he's just walking up the street. And there's people from when he was police commissioner, right? Former policemen, and there's New York State politicians, and there's Rough Riders. And so it really kind of brings home to me that he was always still a New Yorker. And when you look at, again, the kind of president he was and the issues he's interested in, again, a lot of people, the most famous thing for Roosevelt is his time in the West, his nature conservancy in the West, his creation of natural preserves and national parks. But it's really, I think you still see him as this urban progressive trying to look at how writ large you can make New York City and other cities and other towns, safer, healthier, less corrupt places to live. And something like civil service reform is a truism. So, on the one hand, I think Roosevelt does take his political lessons a lot from New York City, but there's also the lessons of New York as a place of immigration, as a place full of tenement. Roosevelt is a president who has intimate contact with the working poor of New York City, with immigrants in New York City, whether that was immigrants involved in cigar rolling in the tenements, or during a heat wave in 1896 when Roosevelt was police commissioner and he championed giving out blocks of ice for free down in the tenement districts, and then toured the back alleys of the tenements to see how the ice was being used, or his famous midnight rambles with Jacob Riis, the author of How the Other Half Lives. Roosevelt, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but really did have a very good sense of how the other half lives and believed that government had responsibility. And the president of the United States has responsibility for how the other half lives. It's not just a laissez-faire government anymore. This is what makes Roosevelt, I think, such an important progressive president. He's one of the first people who says during depressions, with homelessness, with joblessness, at a time when people need help. No, it's not about private charity responsible for these, and the government has no say. Government has a responsibility to help lift up the people most in need.
The last question I have for you is, when you look at TR's New York experiences as state assemblyman, police commissioner, governor, what are the lessons in leadership that we can learn from how he carried himself, where he succeeded, and where he struggled?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes you're right. I think there's a bit of hubris with Roosevelt. There's a bit of kind of righteous indignation that, he's always, battling. It's always Armageddon, and he's always battling for the Lord, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is Roosevelt. But at the same time, there's also a real practicality to Roosevelt, a need to work with the other side, a need to build bridges, a need to work with bosses. And there's this thing that he's the man in the arena, right? He hates the mugwumps. He hates the people on the sidelines who have these big meetings and they clutch their pearls and they tear their hair out about how things are bad, and they sign a petition and then they do nothing. Roosevelt's like, get action, get in the arena, get your hands dirty. You don't like the way things are, do something. Here's 23-year-old Theodore Roosevelt attending Republican district meetings in New York City at a time when the scions of New York's elite do not do this. And so I think that's a big lesson as well. Yes, he was a hunter. Yes, he was a cattle rancher. Yes, he spent time on African safaris and he killed bears. But, he also got in the political arena and he took action and he got things done. And he got things done because he understood the political process. He understood how to, work with congressmen and senators and local leaders. He knew how to work the press. He knew how to use the bully pulpit, as that great Doris Kearns Goodwin book describes. And so this idea and he learned it over a multi-decade public service career. So anytime anybody says, well, Harvard educated, silver spoon, dilettante, no way. There is this 40-year career in public service that, from ultra local level to the White House itself, that informs Roosevelt's politics and how he is as a politician.
Ted, this has been a fantastic interview. If you want to hear more from Ted, please check out A Most Glorious Ride, The Diaries of Theodore Roosevelt, Heir to the Empire City, New York and the Making of Theodore Roosevelt, or any of Ted's numerous other books on our 26th president. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. You can also follow the show on Facebook at Abridged Presidential Histories or on Twitter at APH Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/Abridged Presidential Histories. This helps me buy books and paid host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, we'll be joined again by our old friend Harold Holzer, author of The Presidents vs. the Press, to discuss how Teddy Roosevelt kicked presidential PR into the 20th century and invented the bully pulpit. That's next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.